Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. The American Society of Transplantation is proud to present today's webinar, Applications of AI to Kidney Transplantation of Math and Medicine. This webinar is part of an educational series on applications of AI to transplant, developed by AST's Transplant Administration and Quality Management COP, and the AST Thoracic and Critical Care COP. Today's session is sponsored by AST's Kidney Pancreas Community of Practice. In a moment, I will turn the session over to our moderator, Dr. Silke Niederhaus from the University of Maryland School of Medicine. However, before we begin the main presentation, we do have a few housekeeping notes to help you engage with today's session. There is currently a viewership polling question displayed for the audience. Please take a moment to answer this question while we finish the remaining announcements. This webinar is being recorded, and the archive will be available on the AST YouTube channel 2 to 3 business days after the live session. Please note, all of your lines have been muted so that only the presenters and panelists can be heard clearly for the archive recording. If you have a question for our panelists during the webinar, we encourage you to participate by using the Q&A button in the Zoom webinar panel. Questions submitted via chat are fine, but they may be missed during the presentation. Finally, when you log off at the conclusion of today's webinar, you will see a link to a short evaluation survey to complete. Please fill out the survey to help us keep our content current and engaging. I will now turn the session over to our moderator, Dr. Niederhaus, to begin our presentation.
Thank you, and welcome everyone on this beautiful fall afternoon. Want to thank the AST for inviting me to moderate and inviting my friend Dorry to come speak. He didn't want a long introduction, so you can see the important facts about him already. I think he's a very well-known entity in the world of transplantation. He's professor of surgery and population health, currently working in New York at NYU Langone Health, where he holds a few other positions and minor titles like vice chair in the Department of Surgery. And today we'll hear him speak on applications of AI to kidney transplantation of math and medicine. I'm looking forward to what you have to say, Dorry.
Thanks, Silke. Hello to everyone. I was flipping through the participant list during the introductions, and I see a lot of friends and colleagues, and I will be looking forward to the Q&A interaction with all of you after the talk. And I see the names of some people whose work I'm going to highlight as well. So thank you for all of your work in the field. I opened the AST series on AI a while ago with a lecture on all of the different methods that we use in AI, machine learning, etc. And today I'm going to refresh your memory about some of those methods and then talk about some work that's been done in our field and some work that I anticipate will be happening in our field. And just a reminder that I'm just highlighting some of the work that's been done. There have been hundreds of papers in the realm of AI, machine learning, risk prediction, analytics, et cetera, in kidney transplantation. And I'm going to touch on, obviously, some stuff that's been done in my research group and then some work that's been done outside of my research group and other excellent groups that are working in this space. But there's no way I would be able to cover all of it, of course. This is the COI disclosure for Silke. This is my COI disclosure. Neither of us have relevant disclosures to the content of what I'm going to cover. So when people ask me, where is AI going to be useful? In general, AI is actually useful and not just sort of a toy to play around with in a few instances. One is things we could do ourselves if we had the bandwidth or the staff. So imagine if you had 100 really, really smart medical students or residents, they would be able to do something, but you don't have that bandwidth and you don't have that staff. And so we can use AI to help do those kind of tasks. Things that are too computationally intensive for us to do, meaning we know what we would do, but there's too much math involved in it and we need the machine to do the math. things that are too complicated for us to do. And in a way, we don't really know what to do. So if I told you, find patterns associated with something or another, and I give you data on millions of people, and each one of those people, I give you 100,000 data points on, you wouldn't even be able to tell the computer what to do. You'd need the computer to do some things automatically for you. And because it's too complicated for you to wrap your head around how 100,000 data points are working biologically, mechanistically, et cetera. And that's where AI comes in. And then things that require an expert, but there isn't an expert available. In general medicine, that's not that common. In transplantation, when we do a lot of things in the middle of the night, that is quite common. And so at times where an expert is not available, we can get sort of the next best thing. Maybe the AI can be like 95% of the accuracy of an expert, but at 3 a.m., that's a lot better than, the second-year resident who's reading pathology or something like that. So those are sort of, in general, things to think about of where AI is going to be useful. Last week, I was in India giving a lecture, and I was asked to cover the top 5 ways that our field will be transformed by AI. And I put top in parentheses because, there are a lot more than 5 ways that our field will be transformed. But I focused on these 5 areas, and it seemed like a good way to sort of outline what's been done in kidney transplantation. The areas that I talked about were large language models that understand our field, patient surveillance, evaluating organ offers, donor referral, and improving practice and allocation. And I think those are 5 main areas where we're already seeing AI, and we're going to see AI sort of blossom in helping our field. What do I mean by these things? So the first area is large language models that understand our field. So imagine an LLM bot that can talk to patients, explain medical information, help patients navigate the healthcare system. Again, the kind of thing that if you had the bandwidth, you could do this, but you don't have the bandwidth. So we need sort of help with that. If you're running a very, very busy clinic, and you're seeing patients every few minutes, and you need an update on what's been happening with the patient to review a wide breadth of information about them and give you a summary of it, again, in the way that if a resident came in and spent half an hour with them reviewing their chart and then comes back out to you and summarizes it, an AI LLM that's trained in transplantation would be able to do something like that. Patient summaries when considering organ offers, again, especially those offers that come in the middle of the night, and you want to know, has this patient had cardiac events and things like that, and to have a large language model that can sift through the entire chart and give you a summary of what's been happening with that patient. I'll remind you what a large language model is and what generative AI is. Basically, we talked about this in the first lecture. It's kind of like that next word prediction that you have on your phone. So if you type 3 or 4 words and then you keep hitting that middle button, it will give you, based on what you've said in the past, what is the next word that is likely that you're going to say after those 3 words. Now, large language models like ChatGPT, basically they are this, except instead of being trained on the way you've talked for the last year that you've owned your phone, they're trained on the entire internet. But if you watch ChatGPT working, it gives you a thing and it thinks of the next word and thinks of the next word and thinks of the next word, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's using these like really, really powerful transformer models. And in medicine, we have built transformer models that are medicine specific And I think that what's going to happen is we're going to have more and more transformer models that are transplant specific and are actually even better than the current sort of more generic medical large language models. We have to remember the way this works, because this should give us a fair amount of skepticism. If you use that next word prediction and you're doing something very simple that you do all the time, then obviously it's going to be quite reliable. If you're doing something that you don't do all the time, it will lose its reliability. And we're all reminded of the limitations of generative AI when we look at the art that AI makes, and we see a hand that has 6 fingers on it, and we realize, oh, wait, that art just knows what each pixel means in its context, but it's not actually able to step back and say, oh, that's a hand. A hand generally has 5 fingers, et cetera, et cetera. So there are, sort of these brainstormings of what we might be able to do with large language models. There was a very good one recently in the New England Journal that's worth reading and kind of goes through aspects of patient interaction, medical education, administrative support, clinical decision support, et cetera, the kind of things that we might see ChatGPT and other large language models doing for us in the future. And again, we talk about ChatGPT just because it's sort of the most commonly available one, but as you all are noticing, there are more and more large language models being introduced, and some specifically designed for the medical field, and I think we'll see them specifically designed for transplantation as well. There has been some exploration of ChatGPT and what it can do in our field. In our team, Michael Mankowski is sort of our AI guru, and what he did was take complex kidney transplant cases from the American Society of Nephrology, from ASN, and these were given at ASN Kidney Week. And so we had responses from program directors, fellows, et cetera, to compare to ChatGPT. And he compared 3 sort of recent versions of ChatGPT to see if things are getting better, version 3.5, 4, and 4V, where images are available in ChatGPT as well. And what you see here is that ChatGPT 3.5 answered 42% of the cases correctly, 4.0 increased to 58%, and by 4V, we're at 83%. So, and this is like within a year of iterations of ChatGPT. And one of the things to remember is that these large language models are getting better because the way to build these transformers and to make them more medically specific, et cetera, is improving. And I suspect, as you're probably thinking as well, that when we have the next versions of ChatGPT, it's just going to get better and better, and it's going to outperform all but the true experts. And you see here, ChatGPT 4V far outperformed the audience. It even outperformed the fellows, but it's going to be very difficult to get one that fully outperforms the true experts. Like the nephrology directors, as you see here. But it's getting better, and we'll be able to handle more and more complexity. There's been studies outside of kidney transplant. There's been studies where they've had ChatGPT take the medical boards, take the bar exam, et cetera, and it's becoming much, much better at doing all of those things. ChatGPT can also answer patient questions. And that's really important because we don't have the staff to sit and answer patient questions. This is a paper accepted for publication, not yet available online, but I'm giving you sort of a hint of what we found. Again, if a patient's only option is to do a Google search and to just go down some rabbit holes of what they're going to find in Reddit or on Facebook groups or stuff like that, versus having a ChatGPT AI-driven sort of evaluation of what's available through the literature and online, et cetera. ChatGPT can do quite well at answering patient questions. And so what we did was we fed common patient questions to ChatGPT and then had clinicians rate ChatGPT's responses to these common questions. And it does quite well in some areas where there is a lot of consistently available information, and it does less well in areas where there isn't consistently available information. And they rated these in terms of their accuracy and completeness, but also in terms of the safety, like was there potential harm in the responses that ChatGPT gave? And most things were felt to be pretty accurate, pretty complete, and pretty safe for providing patient information. There was recently another study that looked on Reddit, found typical clinician inquiries, typical questions that people ask their clinicians. This used ChatGPT 3.5. And then it took those answers and it used an online survey company to send to people who participate in online surveys the question and the ChatGPT responses and ask them, do they perceive this information to be quality or not? And it turned out that depending on who was answering the survey, their characteristics impacted their perceived quality of information. So this is a study where rather than having clinicians and experts evaluate ChatGPT's response, they had sort of random citizens evaluating ChatGPT's response. So work continues to be done in our field on the role of ChatGPT as a large language model that can help us in our interactions with patients. Surveillance is another major area. So we follow thousands of patients. They're seen across the healthcare system. Our staff can't keep tabs on everyone at all times, but we all know that if we just kind of let the general medical community take care of transplant patients, bad things are going to happen. What AI can do is it can quickly review the charts of all of those patients across the entire healthcare system and flag people who are getting into trouble, and then take those flags and give it to, for example, our coordinators and say, hey, these are the charts that might be worth investigating. This is in its infancy in our field, but I think this is something that is going to grow a lot. The sort of iconic example of this are these machine learning based early warning systems for sepsis, where people have programmed into their Epic or health record system a flag that monitors a patient and then flags that patient and says, hey, this patient is at risk for having sepsis in the next day or 2 days or week or something like that. And will that impact the way the team takes care of them, et cetera? So the early warning for sepsis is sort of the inspiration for all of this. Even in simpler, neural net based ways, we know that we can, based on current things that are happening with the patient, predict things that we will see in the future. This is work from a few years ago that Alan Massey did, exploring, can we predict which kidney donors are going to get into trouble? And he found that even as early as 6 months post-donation, just your EGFR will predict way down the road, 15 years down the road, whether somebody will have ESKD after kidney donation. And obviously that would then flag those patients as higher risk and impact the way we take care of them. So, this using risk prediction models to take what's going on with the patient as some surveillance and then make predictions about what might happen with the patient later. Alex Lupi and his team have done a tremendous amount of work with iBox, which is this risk prediction, AI-based risk prediction system that integrates everything that's happening with the patient, both pre-transplant and post-transplant, and then makes predictions that are rolling. And this has been used, has been proposed to be used as like a surrogate outcome for clinical trials and as something that, again, might be able to flag for us a patient that we think might be heading toward failure of their allograft and maybe make changes in the way they are treated. When they so they recently published a full international validation study of this, and when they compared the AI system with the abilities of various residents, fellows, senior clinicians at predicting long-term allograft failure, the AI far outperformed this. And I'll read you a quote because it's telling. Physicians' risk predictions showed wide heterogeneity with only a moderate interclass correlation. The determinants of physicians' prediction were disparate, with poor agreement regardless of their clinical experience. And so taking the data available and really making quantitative predictions is something that AI can do in the surveillance of our patients to flag for us those that the AI thinks are getting potentially into trouble. Evaluating organ offers, particularly deceased donor offers, is a fast and time-sensitive process and integrates what's called multimodal data, so imaging, histopathology, clinical data, and we need that data on the donor and the recipient being offered the organ, and we need to be able to integrate all those and make a very quick decision about whether this is the right offer for the right patient. And in this area, there's actually been more work done than in other areas where I think that AI is heading toward helping our field. A lot of work done in prediction analytics and a lot of work done using tools from machine learning. So as you'll recall from the first lecture that we talked about, machine learning sort of transitions from a more supervised learning where I sit with the machine. I tell the machine what I think is important with, based on my mechanistic knowledge and my biological knowledge and what I think is happening. And then it crunches some numbers and it gives me a model. And we're moving then in machine learning tools toward more unsupervised learning where I say, look, these are the data. This is what's happening. This is the observations. This is the real world. You kind of make your way through the data and tell me what are the patterns, what looks like is happening, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're moving from more traditional regression to more unsupervised learning where we don't really know what's happening and we let the machine sort of give us a better sense of that. So I talked about this before. I'm not going to get into the details here, but with regression models, more traditional regression models, we specify all of the variables that we think are important, the functional forms of those variables. So do you think this is a linear relationship? Do you think this is a U-shaped relationship? Do you think there is a spline in this relationship? We also have to specify up front all the interactions. Do you think there's an interaction between race and age or between socioeconomic status and sex of the patient, et cetera? We have to specify all those interactions up front. And all the computer does is find how important each of these factors are that we pre-specified. In a more machine learning unsupervised based approach, we just give it all the data. We tell it what we are trying to predict. We're trying to predict DGF. We're trying to predict graft loss. We're trying to predict waiting time or something like that. And it explores in an unsupervised manner all of the functional forms, the interactions, et cetera. And it tells you sort of at the end of the day, it gives you this semi-black box, and sometimes it can be very black box, and sometimes it can be a more transparent black box of what is happening with the data. So it's completely empirical. Obviously, this is very powerful, particularly when you have a ton of data. But whenever I think about fully unsupervised things, I think about that example from maybe a decade ago, where people built a machine learning based system for reading biopsies and distinguishing between benign and malignant lesions, and it did incredibly well. And then when they tried to validate it on an external set of data, it didn't do well at all. And when they dissected it all out, they discovered that what was happening is in the data that they trained the AI system on, if it was malignant, there was more likely to be a little ruler drawn by the pathologist. And it was smart enough to incorporate the fact that if there was a ruler, it was more likely malignant than benign. And, obviously, when you sort of open the hood and you look to see what's going on underneath, that's not going to be a good system for an AI model. So when you go completely unsupervised, you have to kind of check to see that what it did is something that makes sense to you. You may not have anticipated in advance. It may find for you like a novel, race-age interaction that you hadn't conceptualized before, but it kind of makes mechanistic sense. But don't just go with these things without sort of evaluating, does this really make mechanistic sense? One of the simplest things, but most sort of clinically intuitive things in the machine learning world is a decision tree. Basically, you find the most important variable, you divide the data set in two in the best way possible, and then you keep iterating these things until you sort of meet certain criteria. You can tune those parameters, and then you get a decision tree. And a nice example of that is something that Alan Massey did about 10 years ago, where we were looking to see which patients would benefit from kidneys offered with a KDPI of 90 to 100, and it identified age as sort of the main break point, and age over 50 as like that ideal way to do that main breaking point, and then center waiting time, and then diabetes, et cetera, as other parts of that decision tree. Now, these are quite simplistic, but they give you something that's very, very clinically intuitive, rather than betas from a regression model where you don't really know kind of what to do. More sophisticated machine learning techniques include random forests or gradient boosting. I'm showing you the slides from the first lecture, so if you want to understand how these things work, you can go back and you can re-listen to the details of how these methods work. But effectively, they look at the data in various empirical ways, and they come up at the end with a model that best explains all of the data. Now, one thing I need to remind you is that machine learning is overhyped. There are a lot of people that take things that were done with regression models, and then they think that if they use a machine learning model instead of a more traditional regression model, that they're going to get so much better performance. And that's actually not particularly the case. Regression models work really well when you have a limited number of variables and you've done a good regression model. A good regression model works just as well as a good machine learning model. There are use cases for machine learning when you have more data than you're able to sort of parse through yourself to build a regression model. And so a machine learning model, if it outperforms a regression model, it's usually because there are new data that are added to that model. And there are a number of papers in the literature, I'm not going to call them out, that say, oh, because we used AI or machine learning, we have a better model. And then you look at, they've used 28 variables, where the MELD score, for example, only had 4 variables. And so obviously a model based on 28 variables is going to outperform one based on 4 variables, regardless of whether you used traditional regression or you used machine learning slash AI systems. And so we have to keep that in mind when we're reading the literature on machine learning. Now, there are good use cases for machine learning, and that's when we don't have enough biological information to really understand the impact, when we don't know things mechanistically. COVID was a great example of that. A lot was happening very quickly, and we didn't really understand the mechanism behind all of this. We didn't understand how much of an impact COVID would have on post-transplant outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. And for example, early in the COVID pandemic, we had to decide, are we doing transplants now, or are we waiting until the COVID incidence and prevalence in our area drops to where it's safe to do transplants? And when is it safe to do transplants? And one of the things that Alan Massey did using machine learning and stochastic simulation methods was to evaluate the impact of all of these factors on whether patients would benefit from you doing transplants right now, or whether it would be wise to wait a certain amount of time for things to settle out in your area. And you see here a decision tree, and then you see here a screenshot from the website where he made a calculator available based on these stochastic simulations and based on this sort of AI evaluation to say, okay, right now it's safe to do these things, it benefits patient to do these things, or it's actually unsafe to do these things, it's better to wait, et cetera. So when you don't really know everything about the biology and the mechanistic framework of what's happening, these unsupervised explorations are great. Another example of that work that Sanjay Bay did, when we were trying to figure out what were the most important factors associated with whether a transplant patient would have a response to the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine or whether they would not have a response. We knew that the responses were lower, but we didn't really know what was impacting those things. And, you know, we might have said, sure, the more immunosuppressed you are, the less we expect that you had a response to the vaccine. But we would not have guessed necessarily empirically, I mean, we wouldn't have guessed necessarily biologically that MMF would rise to be the most important factor of whether a patient had a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine response. MMF itself, not the other immunosuppression agents, not the total immunosuppression that the patient had, but specifically MMF. But when you looked empirically and you threw all of that data into a machine learning approach, it can pull out for you the variable importance. And you see here ranked in order with a percentage of how much of the association does that variable describe already laid out for you. So you see MMF is not just the most important, but it is by far the most important predictor. And then you can use those things also to create calculators and things like that. But that's an area where machine learning really shines, is to take something where we don't necessarily have a very, very good understanding of the biology and the mechanistic framework, and to help us evaluate those things. Now, if we looked through this variable list, and one of them was, you know, did a pathologist write a ruler by the vaccine response, then we would know that that doesn't make any sense. So we do have to look at what machine learning gives us and make sure that what it's doing makes biological and mechanistic sense. Although it might create new potential areas of scientific investigation. For example, knowing that MMF was important then inspired the basic science team that was working with us to really try to understand the mechanisms by which MMF was inhibiting the vaccine responses. And they did, and really cool science came from that, and a really cool understanding of sort of the B and T cell responses to these vaccines. So machine learning can also look at data and give you some new potential things that are worth exploring biologically and mechanistically. You know, and again, the whole field of risk prediction has been going on in transplantation for quite some time and has revved up with the availability of some of these better algorithms for creating prediction models. And here's some work that Alan Massey did, you know, early on living donor kidney transplant risk prediction, deep learning HLA matching prediction algorithms, work from Sao Paulo on predicting waiting time to kidney transplantation so people can make better decisions about whether to accept a given organ offer. Again, these tools can be combined to look at the interactions between donors and recipients, sort of early work that Sanjay Bey did here. You can see where you enter the information about the candidate and the information about the kidney that's being offered. And it looks at sort of that interaction between not only is this a good donor and this is a good recipient, but is this the right donor for this particular recipient? What will be the survival benefit for this recipient with these characteristics to take this donor right now versus waiting on the list with whatever their reality is on dialysis for a different available, better available organ that comes their way. And that's sort of older work and is being updated today with the more data that we have and more sophisticated analytical tools. Now, sort of the holy grail of machine learning, maybe we might say today, is the neural network, artificial neural network, convolutional neural network, transformers. These are all sort of terms being used for these mathematical constructs that take some inputs and sort of reweight all of those inputs in these layers of deep learning that each is basically a weighted sum. But if you have enough weighted sums structured in enough ways, it actually does something somewhat intelligent and it gives you an output. And that output may be, is this a picture of a dog or a cat? Or that output may be, did this patient have DGF or not? Or that output may be, is this biopsy representing rejection or not, et cetera. And then if it did it right, or if it did it wrong, it goes back and back propagates a new set of weights to sort of better tune that network in the same way that our brains function when we're learning something. And you're learning a new language and it asks you to translate and you guess the word and you guess wrong. You go back and you back propagate the way your brain works so that hopefully you'll guess better the next time around. And then you sort of are learning things. And that's the way neural networks learn. The large language model neural networks learn by studying the entire internet. Pathology or radiographic imaging neural networks learn by studying a whole bunch of pathology and a whole bunch of imaging to create sort of a very educated transformer, and then they learn specifically on the task at hand. So, for example, understanding histology is something that's been evolving in the last few years, where you can use one neural net to then classify whether this is disease or not. And then if it's disease, you use another sort of more highly trained, more specific neural net to tell you what kind of disease. Is this rejection? Is this other diseases, et cetera? And that work is ongoing. Nothing is perfect right now in the field, but there's a lot of work in trying to create AI systems for reading biopsies and assessing the type of rejection, et cetera. Can you predict the Banff grade based on a deep learning approach? Now, those, I might say, are interesting, but most of us have a pathologist that's available during the day to read a biopsy that was done, that doesn't have a 30-minute urgency associated with it, like a organ offer biopsy. And so new work is being done now to say, okay, it's 3 a.m. We just got a biopsy. There isn't, the head of Banff isn't available to help us read through this biopsy. Can the AI system be trained to do a very good job, a reasonably good job? What happens if we integrate that with all of the clinical information? So this multimodal AI, can we do a better job with multimodal AI as well? So that's an area that is in evolution. I wouldn't say I would trust an AI to read a biopsy right now, but in 5 years, I think we're going to have a lot more reliability in this area. Another area that is in its infancy, but I think again will be something that evolves, is donor referral. So there are millions of hospitalized patients all over the country, and some will become candidates for brain death or cardiac death donation, and we need to identify them as early as possible. And one of the things our group is doing is building these neural net-based AI systems for saying, this person is progressing toward brain death. This is a person that the OPO should know about, and that the clinical team should know about as well as early as possible. Relatively simplistic version of this that doesn't have a ton of AI in it, but shows us the potential power of this was studied by Macy Levan and Patty Niles, where automated donor referral was implemented in some hospitals. And what they wanted to see was, did this impact the referrals that the OPOs were getting, the approaches that happened, the authorizations that happened, and the actual donors that occurred? And indeed, it almost just implementing something relatively simple that was an expert system, that wasn't even a neural net-based system, but an expert system type of approach, almost doubled the number of organ donors in this area. So I think we're going to see a lot more in automated referral, to not rely on the provider team at an outside hospital that maybe sees one donor a year, and instead to implement these things more data-driven way, and to use AI to identify these potential donors as early as possible. So that's another area that I think we're going to see growing. And then we're going to see unsupervised explorations of our data, how we are practicing, what the outcomes are of how we practice, to get novel insights into how we might improve our practice, how we might improve allocation systems, et cetera. Again, this is an area that is just starting to be explored, has been explored with relatively simple analytical methods, and is now growing based on new availability of AI methods as well. A simple example of this is something that Kyle Van Arendonk did a number of years ago, looking at basically feeding all of the data in on pediatric transplants and saying, where is that window where pediatric patients enter a risk phase? The suspicion was that it would be somewhere around age 17, 18 when they transition to adult care, when they are in those years where we see more medication non-adherence, et cetera, et cetera. But to really look at this empirically, and he identified that no matter what age the patient was transplanted, from when they hit 17 to when they hit 24, there was almost 50% allograft loss during that window, identifying that an area where we need to understand why those allografts are lost, and we need systems for improving how to keep those allografts from being lost during that high-risk age window. And again, that high-risk age window, we had some suspicions about, but you really have to sort of evaluate the data in an unsupervised manner to identify what is happening and give us then better things to go after mechanistically and biologically. Jackie Gronzik-Wang used a type of machine learning unsupervised approach called cluster analysis, or hierarchical analysis, where she looked at different transplant centers, and when there was availability of different kidneys of different types of suboptimality, who was a more aggressive utilizer of those, who was a less aggressive utilizer of those, and more importantly, how did these patterns correlate? So was everyone aggressive in everything, or were certain people aggressive in certain areas? And she discovered patterns of aggressiveness across the country. And then once we have those patterns, we can sort of start to think about how we can take what we know and then improve practice accordingly. A recent paper, this is online ahead of print, so not even yet published in AJT, but a recent evaluation that Summer and her team did on out-of-sequence kidney allocation, which, as we all know, has skyrocketed recently. And the question is, can we in a sort of unsupervised manner, really sort of comb through what is happening, try to understand what is happening, and then try to codify what is happening so that we can have a system that has actually works within the system rather than 30 to 40% of organs being allocated outside of the system in a much more sort of Wild West manner. It's working, it's something that's happening, but can we understand what's happening so that we can go back, codify it, pull out the things that are good about it, reevaluate the things that are bad about it, et cetera. And when we let unsupervised explorations sort of look at what is happening, we can then learn things from that. So another sort of door opening to unsupervised explorations impacting our understanding of what we're doing, how our allocation system is working, how we're functioning clinically, et cetera. So I'll go back and remind you about the instances where I think, particularly in healthcare, AI is actually useful. Those are things we could do ourselves if we have the bandwidth and the staff. Things that are too computationally intensive for us to do, we need the computer to do the math. Things that are too complicated for us to do, we need the computer to explore this and tell us what it's finding, and things that require an expert when there isn't an expert available. And I gave you examples from 5 major areas. 1, large language models that understand our field. 2, surveillance, evaluating organ offers, donor referral, and improving practice and allocation. Now, as I said at the beginning, there are many other ways our field will be transformed. AI is not going away. We are going to see this, and we're going to see this grow. And there are many other examples that I didn't have time to go through of other work that's being done in AI, in kidney transplantation across the world. And so again, keep your eyes open because a lot of things are going to emerge in the next 5 to 10 years in this area. I would like to thank and acknowledge our research group. A lot of the work that I showed you was done by a lot of the folks in this research group, and I am very much looking forward to the Q&A part of this. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Dorry, for joining us today. We see a couple of questions already, some in QI, the question and answer section, and some are coming in through the chat. And we'll remind you to, if you can, use the question and answer session over the chat, but we'll try to get to them both. Where do you want to start, Dorry?
I will let you pick the questions.
All right, I'll pick the question. The first question we got through Q&A was, how can I use AI in my hospital?
Well, hopefully the last hour gave some examples of it. I think that we are slowly seeing AI become integrated into our clinical practice. I would caution you to make sure that the AI is doing what you think the AI is doing before relying on it. And I would caution you that particularly today, we still need to have human supervision of AI systems. So I think that those are the 2 sort of most important things to be thinking about. And then keep your eyes open for tools that are emerging that actually can integrate within hospital systems, integrate within your electronic health record. There are Epic tools that are emerging, et cetera, that you can start to implement. And I would also encourage people, if you're implementing these things, study the impact of it, not only for your own sort of knowledge of this, but also for generalizable knowledge.
Awesome. We'll go with the next question I found in the chat is, could you share your thoughts on biases that can be introduced into machine learning models given the quality of EHR data in transplant specifically?
Yeah, so biases in AI is a big area and one that's very concerning, because remember that AI is based on the past. So, if we sort of step back and we think there's a lot of racism in the United States, and if you comb the internet and you think that whatever you see on the internet is the way the world should be, then you are going to have very racist inferences from your AI. And so we're not, we as people want to evolve beyond that, but if we rely on AI will hold us to right wherever we are at the point where the AI was trained. So if the AI was trained last year, we're going to be trapped in last year forever. And so AI needs to continue to evolve. I think with regards to quality of EHR data, there are two areas that we need to think about. One is noise and one is bias. Most of the data quality things that people say, oh, well, this data quality problem is going to cause you bias. That's not true. The data quality problem is going to cause you noise. So you might have a very inaccurate model. When you take the model and you validate it on another source of data, it might not validate very well because there was noise in your data, there's noise in those data, et cetera. Noise we deal with by just continuing to get more data, and the more data we get and the better data we get, the better our models are going to perform. And noise we evaluate by doing external validation. So like the iBox British Medical Journal paper I showed you validated iBox in a whole bunch of different international cohorts. And that's the kind of thing we need to do. Bias means that the differences in the data will cause your inferences to be biased. And to look for bias means we need to understand what is reliable in the data and what's not reliable in the data. If, for example, you are less likely to identify rejection in people who have lower socioeconomic status, who are not coming to your epic hospitals, then yes, your model is going to create something biased. And so you need to understand the data quality and its relationship to the characteristics of the center and of the patient in order to be able to evaluate bias.
That's great. There's a related question somewhat, and that is, should a transplant center look to develop tools that are trained on their own data sets or use tools developed elsewhere?
I think this is a combination. So let's say, for example, I want to build a tool on waiting time in transplantation. I want a tool that you can tell your patient based on their characteristics, this is going to be your waiting time. Now, if you build it just on your transplant center, you're going to have a low number, and you're not going to be able to learn from sort of general trends. General trend is you get listed, more recently, you're going to have longer waiting times than if you got listed a longer time ago, right? Those things you can learn from national data or from multi-center data or from sort of generalized tools. And I think that ultimately what's going to happen in a lot of these areas is we're going to have a main model that represents sort of the general world, and then we're going to have a refinement of that model for your specific world. And I think then there you can learn the way we learn. So, right, like we've learned how to take care of transplant patients. We know in general how to take care of transplant patients. Now, we know specifically how to take care of the patients that are at our hospital more in, sort of in more refined manner. That's sort of a refined version of what we learned as fellows taking care of transplant patients in general. And I think that that's how the AI is going to evolve as well.
Great. We'll go next with a question that relates a little bit to research that we all do. And that's a question, beyond predictive models, how could AI help in designing the best clinical trial and achieving the best outcome?
Yeah, so I think trial design is something that we're using these tools for a lot. iBox is a great example of that. We want to design trials that don't rely on the timeline of graft loss or patient death. And iBox has been adopted in many instances as a surrogate outcome for these things. So you have an early predictor that predicts these later things, and you can create a more efficient clinical trial in that manner. AI can also be used to draw from a whole bunch of
issues with Dorry freezing.
Huh.
Hi, Dr. Segev. This
We'll
is
give him a
Brian
minute.
Blair with AST
He'll
staff.
probably sort it out.
It might be on Dr. Niederhaus's side. We're
okay.
catching you fine, but it looks
You're
like
getting
Dr. Niederhaus. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Please continue. Yeah.
Okay. So AI can also draw from what we know from a lot of studies and then build better sort of sample size calculators and things like that for study design as well. So AI is already being used in study design, and I think that that will expand more. Oh, good. Silke's back.
Ah, I thought you were the one who froze. At least that's what it looked like on my screen, and then I was just waiting. So good. I'm glad it was me, not you. Hopefully everyone got to hear your answer. I suppose as a surgeon, I have to indulge this one question particularly that asks, would you comment on AI's potential application in, say, robotic kidney transplantation? So I guess in the operating room.
Yeah, so in the operating room, we've already seen a ton of AI, right? Like AI helps with stabilization. We're already seeing these sort of haptic mechanical things that AI can help with. And we're seeing that the robotic companies are also building in visual enhancement as well. I think that as visual AI improves, we're going to see, you'll the view you get will be able to enhance blood vessels and things that you're looking for, things that you don't want to sever, et cetera, while you're operating robotically. So I think that we've already seen a lot of AI integrated into robotic surgery, and the visual AI is the new area where we're going to see more of that.
You think a robot's going to do my next kidney transplant?
I certainly hope not.
We'll go with the next question. What do you think about the interpretability challenges of the black box unsupervised models? Have you observed that they encode clinical knowledge in ways that are surprising to you?
Yeah, so as I gave, for example, the MMF example was a very good example of something that we would not have predicted biologically, but we did find empirically. And a machine learning algorithm that ranks the variables can do that for you. I think that today it's quite rare to have fully black box AI. We can pull out from AI sort of information about how it's working under the hood. And I think that that's really, really important. When we can't pull that information out, we have to test it in various ways to make sure that it's not doing anything that's outlandish.
Great. What precautions do you think can help us avoid pitfalls that we've heard in sort of the broader AI world that, AI can perpetuate stereotypes?
I think that's similar to what we talked about with bias. Yes, it not only can, but it does. And we need to keep retraining AI systems. We need to watch AI systems as humans and as clinicians. We need to make sure that they're doing what we expect them to do and that we supervise their integration into our clinical practice.
Yeah. And then I think this is another question, a little different direction, I guess. Where do you see the biggest effect of the cost burden? Like, would insurance companies absorb the cost? Would it fall on patients, other systems?
I mean, I think one of the best things about AI is it's, once you've developed it, it's not costly at all. So for example, if I hire 10 coordinators to answer pre-transplant patient questions, that's going to cost me a lot. If I build a great expert system, a great large language model that will be an expert for those patients and will answer all of those questions, once that's built, that's not going to cost me anything. So I think actually AI will help decrease costs once these things are developed. And I think that in academia and in industry, we're already seeing a boom toward developing these things. And so I think they're ultimately going to decrease our healthcare costs.
Yeah, we have, thank you. We have a few more questions popping in. I don't know that we'll get around to all of them, so I'll pick one last one, and I think this is a good one, just came in. Shouldn't training regarding a basic understanding of AI, its applications, problems, etc., should be part of the curriculum?
Oh, any medical school that right now doesn't cover AI and AI's role in medicine and the way AI is going to grow in our field is a curriculum that is inadequate. I think absolutely understanding the role of AI in medicine is something that every trainee needs to understand.
Yeah, we may need to include some residents and fellows and even of us slowly graying people like myself in that. So thanks for
Well, and I think we should have AST do webinars on AI. Wait, that's actually
Oh, it's
happened.
happening. So great. So great. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Dorry, for sharing your expertise with us. I know there's a couple of questions we didn't quite get to, but we don't want to have our webinars run super late either. I know a lot of you have other places to be and patients to help. So go do your good work.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
AST would like to thank Dr. Segev and Niederhaus, the leadership of KPCOP, TxAQM COP, and TCC COP, and all of our attendees for today's excellent session. Please look for an email from Zoom in about a week directing you to a copy of the recording available free and on demand. Finally, please remember to complete the evaluation survey in Zoom and visit myast.org/education to learn more and register for our upcoming webinars. Thank you all again for today's excellent session.